we're going to talk about that wonderful question, usually the last question that's asked in a job interview. And that's where usually at the end of the interview, the interviewer, whether they're a recruiter or a hiring manager, they turn to you and they say, do you have any questions for us? Right? Have you encountered this before? Usually they ask us right at the end. Sometimes it's because you haven't really had an opportunity to ask anything for the entire interview up to this point, because they've sort of led the interview and they've been interrogating you and they've just been firing these rapid fire questions at you. Sometimes they read them off a sheet, sometimes it's more organic, but you haven't really had a chance to speak freely yet. So now they give you the floor and they say, do you have any questions for us? So you're going to encounter this, so it's good to know how to respond to it. Now, let's get some of the obvious stuff out of the way first. If you don't ask any questions, if they say, do you have any questions for us? And you say, no, right? Usually, that's not good. That signals some negative things in their eyes. They will interpret your lack of questions as a negative thing, and they will look less favorably at you because of it. For example, they might think that you just don't care. You're not interested really that much, right? So you don't have any questions. Or they might think that you haven't done any preparation for the interview, which also is a negative. They might also think that that's because you don't care very much about this job. Or another thing they could conclude is that you're desperate. You're desperate for a job, which they consider to be a negative. And because you're desperate for a job, you're just applying to everything. And as a result, you don't really have any specific questions about this job because this is not that special to you. You're applying for everything you can get. So if you don't say anything, it's bad. So what can you say? Well, there's several sort of good questions that you could ask. I'm going to give you some examples. You could also make up your own that are kind of variations on this too. But the most obvious would be, how has this position become available? Right? That's a pretty good one. Now, depending on what they say, there could be opportunities for you to ask follow-up questions. So if they said somebody retired, or they said it's a new position that we're creating, if it's a new position, the obvious question is, well, why did you guys decide to create this? What was the thing that instigated this, right? So that's always a popular choice, and that's one of the more obvious questions. There's many things you could do here. You could talk about where are things going in the future? Where do you see this company going in the future? Or where do you see this industry going in the future? Or you can even ask, like, okay, we've talked about the role now, but where do you see this role going in the future? Do you see it evolving to take on other duties and responsibilities too? Right? So the future question is good. What do you see in the future for the role, the company, or the industry? Okay, those are great questions. Another variation on this is challenges. This can be an even better question because it allows you to get some insight into the job, into the role. You can say, what do you see as the main challenges for this role, for the person in this role going forward, right? Or you could extend that to the industry. What do you see as the main challenges for this industry going forward? Or what do you see as the main challenges for this company or this organization in the future or in the near future? Okay, those are all great too. And if you ask questions about the role, you could be getting insights into what's going to be involved in doing this role. And that's a great thing because you can maybe then speak to, briefly, you could speak to, oh, I have that, or I enjoy that, or something like that, and get even more points. There's other things you could say too. I mean, those would probably be good, but there's a lot of other things you could say. You could ask more personal questions of the interviewer. You could say, well, if I can ask, like, what do you personally enjoy the most about working here? Right? That would be a great question. You could even ask a more exotic question. You could say, well, if you were CEO of this company, what would you change? Right? Now, personally, a lot of other people will recommend that question. I don't know if I recommend that question as much because they won't really be able to speak freely. So they'll give you maybe a non-answer, or they'll give you some trivial thing. They won't really dish the dirt on the company or the role. But, you know, it might be, if you have a good rapport with the interviewer, it might be something that might be an intriguing question to throw at them. More questions about the role. The role is good. We talked earlier about challenge-related questions, like what do you see the challenge as the main challenge for the person in this role? We already talked about that. An extension of that would be saying, you know, what would a typical day for someone in this role involve? Right? You know, walk me through their day. What would they do in a typical day? On a typical day. That could be a good question. That gives you more insight into the role. An extension of that is asking them something along the lines of, if I were in this role, what would be your expectations of me in the first 30 days, 60 days, or 90 days? You know, and they might be able to sort of draw you a very crude map and say, well, in the first 30 days, we'd expect you to, you know, understand this and be doing these duties. Then in the next 30 days, we'd expect you to take on more of these duties. And then finally, by the 3-month mark, we expect you to be fully over the learning curve and doing the entire role unassisted or something like that. And it gives you an idea of what's going to be expected of you if you were in the role. Another great question to ask is, what types of people do you see as that are generally successful in this role? So they would say, well, we expect people that have a background in sales to be very successful, or we have people with a strong technical background would probably, you know, have a pretty easy time in this role. They'd be very successful. You know, something like that. That gives you more insight into the role, so you could perhaps speak to, you know, what they say. You could maybe, it gives you opportunity to say, oh, you know, that's great because I did sales. We didn't talk about this, but I actually did sales for 5 years. So that's perfect. You know, something like that gives you extra points. And the last sort of big question I would recommend that people could use in their arsenal of questions to ask would be this question here. It's a bit long-winded, but bear with me. It's, have you seen anything in other candidates that you haven't yet seen in me that I could perhaps speak to? I myself have asked that question in job interviews years ago, and that produced some very positive results. If the recruiter or hiring manager or any other interviewer has some reservations about you that they haven't really shared with you, sometimes they will disclose it when you ask this question and say, well, you know, you did really well. Other candidates seem to have a stronger technical background than you do. You know, so that might be your weak area, but, you know, and that gives you the opportunity to say, well, you know, something interesting that hasn't actually come up in this interview is the fact that I once did a project on this, you know, 2 years doing this. And I think that really is relevant to this, you know, or something like that. And then you have a chance to slip in a little thing at the very end that gives you some more points. So those would be the main questions I would ask. The final question you always want to ask at the end of a job interview, no matter what the context, is you always want to say, where do we go from here? Right? So where do we go from here? Usually when you're shaking their hand or, you know, doing the elbow bump or the chest bump or however you end an interview in your particular industry, whatever is standard to end a meeting and say your goodbye. While you're doing that, it's great to ask this. So where do we go from here? And you want to know if they're going to call you or you should call them, or, you know, when can you expect to hear of a decision, or if you won't hear of a decision. It would be good to know that, right? So this gives you the opportunity to ask that question and get some clarification on what's going to happen next. Okay? So those are some great questions to ask. You don't have to remember all of these. If you have maybe 3 questions, the third one being, where do we go from here? Usually that will be sufficient. I would recommend one of the 3 questions would be about the role. And if you do that, you will pass this question. You will get some insights into the role, allow you to maybe get some final couple of points and make yourself look better as the lead contender. But that's what I would say to this question. Now, the other great thing about this question that not a lot of people know is that if you are good at reading body language, okay, asking this question at the end can be a bit of an indicator on how well you did in the interview. So depending on how eager they are to answer your questions and spend time with you answering questions at the end of the interview, that can be sometimes be a general indicator of how you did. If they just want to get you out of the room quickly, they don't seem to be super interested in talking to you anymore, that tells you something. If, on the other hand, they're wanting to make time and they start giving you long and detailed answers to the questions you're asking, and they don't mind talking to you and they're enthusiastic about talking to you, that can signal that you did pretty well, right? So that's the other great thing about this question. So pay attention to their response when you are asked this at the end and you start firing questions at them. And hopefully that makes sense. If you do want to go deeper in this, check out that course. All my recommendations for everything are there. Link in the description.